Welcome, everyone. Today is Wednesday, March 31st, 2021. I'm Professor Emily Lawson, or Auntie Emily, or Ate Emily, as many of the Filipino American students call me. This is Asian Pacific Islander American Studies, American Culture 353, History 454, Asians in American Film and Television at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And since we are still in a pandemic, we have been meeting virtually all year. And thank you all for joining us today. We have around 115 folks online right now, and I think there were way more who had signed up, so they'll be coming in as we go along in this webinar today. We ask everyone, as you know, if you've joined us in the last few weeks for our other webinars, we're asking everybody to type your name in the chat. There's a little chat box there on Zoom, and where you are from, since that is a microaggression that all Asians are usually asked every day. So where are you from, or what indigenous land are you logging in from today? And if you're an actor or a wannabe actor, or if you're Hmong American, if you're a refugee, or from B. Vang's hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota, or from my hometown of Seattle, Washington, we want to know that. We want to know that too. You can use the chat for comments and reactions. Since we can't see you, we can only see the chat. And so we're going to rely on you to help us keep the energy up and to give any reactions and comments as we are going along in the conversation today. If you have questions, please use the Q&A question function. There's a little Q&A box so that we can keep the questions separate from the comments. All right. And we will be monitoring those over the hour, so you could put those Q&A questions in the Q&A box. If you are a student enrolled in the class and you would like to appear on screen with B. Vang and our other guests, please also note that in your question in the Q&A box. Okay. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies Program, the Department of American Culture, especially our events coordinator, Lisa Toon, who's been working behind the scenes, making all of these flyers, setting up the webinars for us. Shout out to Lisa, and thank you, thank you, thank you. Shout out to the United Asian American Organizations, UAAO, our coalition of student organizations on campus, and to the Filipino American Students Association, FASA, for always helping spread the word about all of our events. Okay. And speaking of that, I should just run through these really quick. If you like to join us, on April 12th, we will have a webinar with the editors of the book Fight the Tower, Asian American Scholars, Resistance and Renewal in the Academy. And you can look that up on our events.umich.edu website. And next week, we'll have James Benny Wilson, who's an independent filmmaker and Filipino American adoptee. And we'll also have filmmaker Grace Lee. Okay. All right, so I want to just talk a little bit about why we teach this film, Gran Torino. The students in the class had to watch a series of films this semester. Last week they watched, or 2 weeks ago, they watched Who Killed Vincent Chin, which you see my t-shirt, and the mural that our Detroit Asian Youth Project painted as a result of learning about that. But why we teach this film? We teach this film, Gran Torino, because it was filmed in Detroit, Highland Park, Michigan, where Vincent Chin was actually beaten to death on Woodward Avenue. It was also filmed in Royal Oak, Michigan, and Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan, just a few blocks actually from where I used to live. Locals may recognize a St. Ambrose Church there, or Point Hardware Store, which had a poster of Gran Torino on its walls for years. As difficult as it is to hear all of the racist tauntings in this film, every scene, to me, is a teachable moment, not only in race relations, but in the history of Hmong American refugees in Detroit and the Midwest. And it's also a teachable moment about the legacies of American wars in Asia. The scenes with the character of Walt, played by Dirty Harry star Clint Eastwood, which you saw in the trailer earlier as you were coming in. The scenes with the character of Walt and Thao, who was played by our guest today, Bi Vang, those scenes are prime examples of how truth and reconciliation can lead to transformative and restorative justice. Okay, and these are all much needed and necessary concepts in our world today. Both characters have to atone for their sins. Walt in his killings, as he did in the Korean War, and Thao for his attempt to try to steal Walt's car, hence Gran Torino. Okay. And so these are all really good examples of how our communities can use truth and reconciliation and transformative justice and restorative justice kind of practices, right, in our communities. Instead of calling the cops, instead of, trying to jail and imprison Thao, the family actually says, hey, he's going to work with you to learn his lesson. And they may not call it restorative justice or transformative justice in the film, but it's what we activists and scholars and community folks in Detroit definitely rely on and definitely embrace. Okay. So as we were planning the syllabus for this course, our incredibly hardworking grader for the course, Sarah Day Dion, a graduate student now in the University of Michigan School of Education, just casually mentioned to me that she went to college with our guest speaker today. And what I want to invite Bi Vang, I said, oh my goodness, yes, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, shout out to Brown University. All right now. So here to introduce Bi Vang, please give a warm welcome to Sarah Day Dion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ate Emily. I'm so excited for this opportunity to bring some of our different communities together. I met Bi back when we were in college, and we actually shared a mentor in Professor Naoko Shibusawa, whose research focuses on U.S. history and empire. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to her and any members of the past and current K-Team writing group in the audience. And I know that she's in the audience too. So we're really grateful for her. I'm also really grateful for Bi and all of the Asian American folks, the faculty, the staff, the students who came together as organizers, as an organizing and learning community to help and hold space for us while we were at Brown. So now to formally introduce Bi. Bi Vang, at 16, held the leading Hmong American role as Thao Vang Lor in Clint Eastwood's 2008 film, Gran Torino. He subsequently performed in independent films and on stage at Brown University, where he received a 2016 liberal arts degree in international politics, media, and cultural studies. He also trained in China in techniques of Chinese opera and Japanese performance. Throughout this time, Vang engaged in social justice and media activism and published works related to the visibility and inclusion of Southeast Asian Americans, and more broadly, Asian Americans in Hollywood and mainstream popular culture. His work covers such topics as representation, race, gender, sexuality, production, geopolitics, refugees, criminal justice, and mass incarceration. Vang presented at multiple conferences related to these topics and publicly lectured or gave workshops in over 30 venues, domestically and overseas, including the University of Toronto, Beijing University, Minzu University, and Zhongshan University. Meanwhile, Vang worked at MSNBC with The Rachel Maddow Show in broadcast journalism, at The Economist in print journalism, and at First Look Media in documentary filmmaking with Laura Poitras. After several years of working as a print journalist, nonfiction writer, and policy researcher, he recently moved to LA to devote himself to acting, filmmaking, and other creative pursuits. Please give a warm welcome to Bi Vang.
Hi, everyone. A little weird to not hear any kind of applause, but that's just the nature of Zoom and doing anything these days during COVID-19. So thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Sarah and Professor Lawson for making all of this possible. I'm feeling a lot of nostalgia watching the Gran Torino trailer, and also hearing from Sarah and seeing familiar faces on the participants list. So thank you. It's a great way to start off the day. Um, so I wanted to start off by saying that the NBC op-ed, which you all read, hopefully, was a very truncated version of the work and scholarship and research that I've done for over 10 years, as Sarah said. Everything that led up to Gran Torino and its release was my inflection point. It was my political awakening. And so it's important for me to emphasize a film's release, because up until then, I had been saying that a film is just a film. And it wasn't until I was sitting in theaters, witnessing the laughter and engaging in conversations about Gran Torino that things really changed for me. I went on a journey, my own coming of age through activism, writing, researching, the arts, and more. Um, Switch slide. I'm not sure if the slides are up. Yep, this one. Thank you. So I wanted to share this story of my first speaking engagement to show you all why things quickly changed for me. Shortly after Gran Torino's release at the end of 2008, I was invited to the University of Pacific in Stockton, California. The event was called The Real Gran Torino Story, Stockton's Secret War on the Streets. Notice the use of secret war as a kind of metaphor here, referencing the secret war in Laos. So this community event used Gran Torino as a vehicle to raise awareness about and to address the issues of Southeast Asian American gang and gun violence in the city of Stockton. It was powerful being a part of the conversation there that centered community members. The issues of food deserts, unemployment, low wages, gangs, police brutality, and incarceration were raised. Politicians and local officials heard personal testimonials from members of the Hmong, Lao, Viet, and Cambodian communities of Stockton. And this was in part because of Gran Torino. So a film isn't just a film. After Stockton, I was invited to speak more. I went from venue to venue, speaking engagement after engagement. And just a reminder, I was still 16. It was at these speaking engagements where the question about the slurs in Gran Torino was raised. And it was uncanny because it was always an Asian American audience member who raised the question about those slurs. And like that, it was always mostly white people who would say in response that they themselves didn't find the slurs offensive, and that those who did were just too sensitive. So at these, talks, what was being said was, for us to get over it or to learn to take a joke. And this was a recurring thing at all of the talks that I gave. It always happened. So this was what my NBC op-ed was about. What I saw and heard was this reduction of Asian Americans to jokes, being told to get over it or learn to take a joke. These were things that were meant to shut us down. And this was exactly how the public responded to anti-Asian racism in the early days of COVID-19. The jokes and the laughter in the theaters, these were attempts to reduce Asian Americans to jokes, punchlines, and to reduce Asian American issues to racial non-issues. So for them, for these people, anti-Asian racism was seen as less harmful and less insidious. And so, of course, anti-Asian racism was shrugged off and it wasn't taken seriously. So, of course, the racial hatred that we saw was swept under the rug and ignored. And this was why the racial hatred erupted with such grotesque violence in Atlanta, Georgia. Switch slide. So as I continued speaking, I began to see that the slurs were not just a function of a racist character in a script. Sure, we can argue that Walt was part of an anti-racist allegory, but this interpretation ignores the consequences of a film's unintended messaging and its reception. Because it doesn't matter what the intentions are or what the text of the film is. How it is received by viewers is not unidirectional. There are many, many ways that the film can be interpreted. So One interpretation praised Gran Torino as the post-race and Obama-era film. At some point, even the White House issued a statement that the Obama family was watching Gran Torino. The praises that followed were, see, racism is over. It's no longer a problem. We are all a part of the human race. Or see, this movie shows us what it means to overcome our differences and move on from racism. Racism no longer exists. Switch slide. So there were other white audience members who came up to me afterward to tell me about their relatives watching Gran Torino and one particular scene. And that scene was when Korean War veteran Walt Kowalski said, "I used to stack fucks like you 5 feet high in Korea, used you for sandbags." So basically what was happening was there were these audience members who came up to me and told me in private that they had white relatives who laughed at that line and repeatedly quoted it. And apparently they really loved that line. And so clearly this film is an important text that harkens us back to these wars fought in Asia, as Professor Emily Lawson said in her introduction. And so I was deeply disturbed by this, like the laughter at the language of destruction and death of Asian bodies. There was clearly more to this laughter than just funny jokes. I knew that Gran Torino was, at that point, I knew that Gran Torino was a cinematic fiction that people lived in. It was a chance for mainly white viewers to process their guilt and their racism through the moral ambiguity represented by Eastwood's character, Walt Kowalski. Laughter wasn't a laughing at Walt, but a laughing with. It was their process of identification. And this viewing experience was clearly not a harmless viewing experience. It was their collective catharsis. So knowing this, I was quite upset that no one took anti-Asian racism seriously enough when it became hypervisibly seen. I had learned all of these things that I took with me in my career, and I saw, all of this being played out again in real time as the COVID-19 pandemic happened in early of last year. So even some 10 years later, we are still only getting at the heart of what is wrong with how this country responds to and thinks about anti-Asian racism. Asian America as an incoherent racial collective is overlooked. We know that. It is hard to define, it is hard to approximate, and it eludes the public. So yes, what we're living today is the result of the failure and inability of our language to say anything of substance about Asian America. Switch slide, please. So I pose this to you all. A concept's semantic conventionalization determines whether or not that concept can achieve a social strength as a thinkable thing, and whether or not it will enter into a language's lexicon. This is what linguists call linguistic cognitive lexicalization. In other words, something becomes linguistically intelligible by the frequency of its use. In other words, or simply put, before a concept can become thinkable, that concept must have been uttered innumerable times until it became fathomable, and easily articulated and obvious. So you can think of it this way. That saying, a lie when repeated enough becomes the truth. Becoming the truth, or becoming a social fact, is how a concept achieves a social strength as a thinkable thing. Asian Americans carried the weight of this linguistic burden. It wasn't enough that we had to speak ourselves into the spotlight, because if no one could fathom us, and if no one could perceive us, how could they possibly hear us or listen and make sense of what was happening to us? So again, anti-Asian racism was hard to call out, as we all knew. It was hard for many to see. It was something that was clearly unthinkable. And even when there was a chance to talk about what was happening, all that could be said was perfunctory and a display of an impoverished understanding of Asian Americans and Asian America. So we were not understood, and this invisibility became deathly. And yes, this invisibility is but one of the many effects of anti-Asian racism. Because, as we're saying, as everyone is saying now, who would have thought that Asian Americans struggle? Who would have thought that Asian Americans are racial minorities? So what we're seeing is the hegemony here at work, working through the various sites of cultural production: movies, law, political institutions, elite high schools, and our education, news media. And, this is all about the model minority myth, right? We're just too well off, too well educated, too docile, and too whatever, immune to racism. So, who would think about us suffering or struggling? So even if Gran Torino showed Asian Americans, Hmong Americans, showed our poverty and our dysfunction, that wasn't enough to disrupt the ways that people perceive Asian Americans. So those of us who know about Asian American history know that what happened in Atlanta, Georgia was tragically inevitable. Inevitable. What we saw in Atlanta was the practice of an ideology of anti-Asian racism that was brought to a head. It was what we might call a heightening of contradictions that made it possible for everyone to see what this moment of anti-Asian racism was really about. The refusal to recognize Asian humanity, like the wars fought in Asia, like the joke or the laughters at what Walt Kowalski said about stacking Korean bodies, Asian bodies, like sandbags. Next slide, please. So as Edward Said wrote in Orientalism, he said, every one of them, the Orientalists, kept intact the separateness of the Orient, its eccentricity, its backwardness, its silent indifference, its feminine penetrability, its supine malleability. Basically, the discourse about who Asian Americans are was taken as more real than actual Asian Americans could ever be. And likewise, the Orient, as the Orientalists saw it, was more real than the actual Orient could ever be. Orientalism, too, had achieved a social strength as a thinkable thing. So Edward Said's point was that there was this large body of work that rendered the Orient obvious and understandable on certain terms, that made it so readily available to be conjured up when speaking about the Orient. So it thus became accepted as a social fact, the truth, the Orient, that is. So Orientalism was ultimately about shoring up the identity of the self and the speaker, because it was always showing more about who and what the speaker was than the object of what was being described. So Orientalism made so real and had over elaborated the notions of difference that it in turn posited an otherness of the Orient, an otherness that was so absolute that the discourse of Orientalism became wrapped up with colonialism, imperial ambitions, and geopolitical domination. We may think of, anti-Asian racism as just symbolic slights that are seemingly innocuous, right? But those symbolic slights are grounded in actual historical moments, as Edward Said says, because the point of Orientalism is that it was the ideology of Orientalism that led to conquest, war, and domination. And this was a moment that the West acted upon because of the idea of Asianness as being the inverse of the humanity that was represented by the West. So nothing linguistically meaningful was said about Asian Americans until recently. Before this moment, all that could be said was how white adjacent and high achieving Asian Americans are, how Asian Americans defected from the racial justice political project, how apolitical and anti-affirmative action Asian Americans are, and more divisively, how racist and anti-Black Asian Americans are. These narratives had a great social force, and they said more than anything else could. Change the slide, please. Take this meme, for example, that went viral a couple of days back. It crossed out "Stop Anti-Asian Hate," as you see here, highlighting only "Stop White Terrorism." There really was and is a committed effort to make anti-Asian racism not nameable. I can't possibly imagine why this moment that is clearly calling out anti-Asian racism would be shut down like this. Why might this meme be dangerous? Because it obviates the very specific nuances of anti-Asian racism, nuances that are unique to how Asian Americans are racialized and how we Asian Americans experience our race in this country. Yes, sure, at the heart of anti-Asian racism and any kind of racism is white supremacy, but what this risks is flattening the differences of racialization across communities of color. I mean, BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, was an abbreviated shorthand coined precisely because the differences across communities of color were so irreconcilable. So why elide specifically anti-Asian hate? The term BIPOC already subsumes Asianness under the category as the other people of color. So to do just this is to enact a symbolic violence against Asian Americans yet again, and to ignore the anti-Asian racism that is not only restricted to white America, as if suddenly we can no longer take into account the human and moral agency of the perpetrators of anti-Asian racism simply because they're not white. Asian humanity has never been recognized. The wars fought in Asia are proof enough. This moment is proof enough. But all of this leads us back to the question of how did it come to this? Truly, what happened was that Asianness was turned into a thing against which Asian Americans could not defend ourselves, a fallible and invidious thing that was neither immune to hate nor freed from criticism. Asian Americans were so universally despised that when it came time to talk and think about Asian Americans, nothing was done and nothing was said. It was as Noel Quintana said after he was slashed across the face in New York City, "I shouted for help, but nobody helped me." And just as yesterday, it was as 3 men demonstrated with their casual brutality of simply closing doors as a Filipina American, Vilma Kari, was kicked by her assailant to the cement. I have long been politicized by all of this. I've studied about it. I've dedicated my 4 years at Brown and more to researching it, to writing about it, to thinking about it, to organizing around it, that it also even became a beat for me when I went on to work in journalism, when I went on to do media making, filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, and policy research. And I still do this work because it's important to me as an advocate, and because clearly this work needs to be done. The fact that Gran Torino was recognized by the American Film Institute, a pretty prestigious institute, says a lot about anti-Asian racism in this country. So, at the end of it all, many people would like to ask me, do you regret doing Gran Torino? No. What I regret is not speaking up sooner. And this brings me back to the fact that I am an artist and I will never let go of this part of my life. I came back to acting because I finally now believe in the power of storytelling, because I didn't before. So thank you. That's the end of the presentation.
Oh my goodness. All the hand claps in the world for you, Mark. Thank you for giving my week's lecture. This is I'm sure the students enjoyed it much more hearing it from you than from me. Look at all that applause. Yeah. Yes, y'all. Okay. Awesome. Amazing.
Thank
Um,
you, everyone.
Thank you. While I'm introducing our next speaker to join us today, folks can, continue to give. Oh my goodness, your professors are here. I know. Please, continue to give the applauses, and also feel free to ask questions in the in the in the Q&A box. If you are just joining us, we were having folks type your name and where you're from, or if you're Hmong, or if you're from Minnesota, or an actor, put that in the chat, but save the questions for the Q&A box. And if you want to appear on screen, put that in the Q&A box too. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Our next speaker, I've invited to join recently because I wanted to have her tell the story that I always tell. We've been teaching this film since it came out. But one of the reasons why we teach this film is because I was really incredibly blessed to be one of the co-founders of the Detroit Asian Youth Project, which was a mentorship program primarily for Hmong American and Bangladeshi American teenagers in Detroit, Hamtramck, and Warren, Michigan. So any Day Project alumni in the house, shout out in the chat, y'all. Thank you. I saw a couple of you, so thank you for joining us. When we were running Day Project, we actually received an email from one of the film's producers for Gran Torino, that they wanted contacts to the youth so that they could be extras. They wanted Hmong American teenagers as extras for this film. And at first I thought it was spam. I really did. I thought it was spam or a phishing email, to try to get a scam, and why would Clint Eastwood, right, want to make a film about Hmong American teenagers, right, in Detroit, of all places, right? Well, it turns out because of tax breaks. But our coordinators investigated it and discovered, hey, this is kind of legit. So I still am a protective mama about our students and the students' privacy. And so we told the producers, okay, give us a flyer and the information, and we'll provide it to the youth and their parents and so forth. And our next speaker was actually one of the Day Project mentors at the time, who was also an artist and a publisher of 18 Xeem, 18XEEM, a local Hmong American magazine, which also published the article that the students had to read for this week, which was on Chonburi Shong, the late Chonburi Shong. This is the magazine there. And actually, our speaker actually helped us do community organizing around Chonburi Shong's killing. In 2006, Chonburi Shong was shot 41 times at close range by the Warren, Michigan police. And police commissioner rules that the officers, quote unquote, acted properly. Okay, so our Detroit Asian Youth Project found out about this because one of our youth, the teenagers, came to one of our sessions the day after it happened, and was distraught, and had said his uncle had been shot by the police. And we saw it on the news, and we thought, oh my goodness, right? And so we leapt into action mode and led a year-long campaign against police brutality to educate everybody, but especially the Hmong American community, about alternatives to calling the police. And so our speaker actually helped us helped us kind of do that as well. Let me see. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, last November, 2020, Mai Lee, we call her Lee, Mai Lee Xiong was elected to the Macomb County Board of Commissioners for District 2, representing the residents of Centerline and parts of Warren. She is the first Hmong American elected official in the whole state of Michigan. Uh, she earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts in Graphic Design from the College for Creative Studies with a focus on web design. She's a small business owner and designer of My and Company, a modern Hmong American apparel and accessories brand with a boutique in Warren. She's a board member of Rising Voices of Asian American Families, which was founded by some of our Asian Pacific Island American Studies alumni. Shout out Rising Voices, and volunteers for Meals on Wheels and March of Dimes. She's also a proud mother of 4, and in 2007 to 2009, she served as a mentor in our Detroit Asian Youth Project. She was an extra and a cultural consultant for the film Gran Torino. Please give a warm welcome to Commissioner Mai Xiong.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you for always uplifting the voices of Asian Americans, especially the youth, and for co-founding Day Project, because that really changed so many lives, including mine. And I see the youth now, they're all grown up, and it's hard to see them as adults because we're so used to seeing them when they were young. And it's hard to go after and be just, wow, your presentation was just absolutely amazing. And my heart breaks hearing about, you speak and your experience, not with just the movie, but afterwards, and having to stand up for Asian Americans, because as minorities, we often minimize and normalize this type of treatment. Okay. And so it's just been wonderful seeing you grow up from being that 16-year-old leading actor in Gran Torino and now being an activist yourself. I am just in awe. And again, my heart just breaks hearing you talk about that experience and having to do all of these, outreach and talking about it, because it resonates so much with me. So let me talk a little bit about my how I got involved, because I think most people don't know this. But as Emily said, the producers had contacted Day Project wanting to be connected to the Hmong community. And so I live in Warren and lived here for over 18 years. So shout out to everyone who was in the chat and said they were from Warren and beyond. Thank you all for joining us today. They actually contacted me, Rob Lorenzo, the producer, and the executive producer, Tim Moore. And I was very much like Emily, not sure if this was legit or not, but I actually agreed to meet with them. So I met with them at a restaurant. They gave me the script, asked me to read through it, and if there were any cultural inaccuracies, then for me to jot it down and to let them know. So I was one of the very first persons to have that script. And I remember reading through it. The part where Sue was raped, that stood out to me the most, because and the gangs, because growing up as a teenager, those were things that I didn't personally experience, but I had cousins or friends who went through, were either pulled into a gang, or cousins that were just raped by gangs. And so that to me felt very real, and the script was very raw. But you have to know that the script was written by a white man and the movie was produced by a white man. So the perspective has always been from the white person's perspective and not from the Hmongs. All right. So one thing, Emily, you talked about, every scene in the movie is a teachable moment. And that is so true. It's so important to note that racism is taught. It's not something that we are born with. And so even though this movie, had so much recognition, and so many people found it positive. But you talked about it being a reflection of the white male, and that they're laughing with Walt and not at Walt, right? And those are all so very true. And so we have to remember that the historical aspect surrounding the American history dates back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese internment camps. Their racism has not gone away. Even after this movie came out, and again, most people don't know that I was a cultural consultant for the movie. It's because I never actually received credit for it, unfortunately. And after the movie was released, for a long time, I didn't want to watch it because I read the script, right? I knew what was coming. I was on set, and there were scenes in the movie that were just over dramatized because Hollywood is very much about expressing stereotypes of Asian Americans, the Mexicans and the Black people in the movie. Like all of those things were just so stereotypical, and it was just blown out to be so dramatic for Hollywood. So for a long time, I didn't want to watch the movie, and I didn't watch it just because I was ashamed about the words and the constant calling Asian or Hmong in the movie, you know, gooks and all of these other names. And yes, you know, at the end, maybe Walt, you know, he had some sort of redemption. But you have to know that Hmong men and women are independent, are very much capable of standing up for themselves. And this movie was about the white person coming to save a community. And that's not how it always is. And you see in real life that, you know, we have Asian Americans who are very successful and very well educated. And almost halfway through the first part of the movie, there was never a point where someone stopped Walt or talked back to him and said, you know, hey, don't call me that, or, you know, why are you degrading us? That didn't start happening until B or Thao in the movie started to stand up. And when he was pushing up the appliance, and he said, you know, you asked for my help. So that was when you really saw someone actually speaking back and talking back to Walt and telling him, you know, I don't care if you call me racist things, like it's not going to faze me. So that's the perspective that I bring to the movie. And these are feelings that I've held on for so long. And yes, it was a wonderful opportunity for the Hmong community to take part in a Hollywood movie. Like that was a big deal, and it still is a big deal. And so I don't want to, you know, say that's not important, because there are two perspectives and interpretations of this movie. And I resonate so much with the presentation that you know, B shared with us, and I've felt that from day one, from the day I received the script. And there wasn't much change from the script to what you actually heard on screen. And so those things really bothered me. And even as a cultural consultant, I mean, you know, you can give them advice, but at the end of the day, they'll do what they want to do to get those types of reactions. And so you just kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mai. If you have time to stay on screen with us, I want to bring back B to open up some of the Q&A. And I totally agree with what you're saying, and that's why we kicked the referral to you, Hoka. I know you could handle it better than I could. But also, I think this film is also, I mean, just a kind of continuation of Dirty Harry, right? But maybe Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood films gone kind of better, or finding some redemption for himself. I don't know, but very masculine.
And if I can
lots
just
of masculinity, toxic masculinity.
If I could just add to that, Emily,
Yeah.
Professor Emily, that movie came out in 2008.
Right.
And then Obama was our president,
Right.
and they said racism was over. It was acceptable maybe that back then, but now, after going through, you know, living in a pandemic and knowing that there's a rise in anti-Asian hate Crimes and Racism. That
Exactly.
movie, I don't think would have had the type of reaction that it did back in 2008 if it was
Absolutely.
2021.
I
Because
agree.
now it's not acceptable.
And I think I may have told you I didn't want to see that film, but it was the students. Shout out to the students who said, "You got to see this film because some of the Day Project folks are in it," and actually the local community folks, as you know, maybe others don't know, but the elders, the teens, the extras, they actually are from our Detroit Hmong American community, and they were related to
So
our Day
almost
Project.
everyone in that film is very much from Michigan, right?
Yes.
Except for some of the, the main actors, but all the extras, I mean, we knew them, they were
Yes.
family and friends. And even till this day, they talk about how they were able to beat Clint Eastwood and that they got a picture with him. So that was their way of, that was their experience, right? But going back to what I said earlier, as Asian Americans and people
Yes.
who are historically marginalized, we tend to normalize these experiences.
Right.
So they're not going to take offense, or if they do, they're not going to speak up about it.
That's
Like
right.
me and like myself. And I held on to these feelings for over a decade, and people didn't know. But yeah, I didn't want to watch it. And whenever it came on TV, I would change the channel, even though I took such an important role in the movie. Like I just felt ashamed that I was a part of this ongoing racism.
I feel
and again,
you.
racism is taught.
That's right.
It is taught.
I feel you. I hear you.
Born with.
I feel you. I hear you. All right. We're gonna go try to get. That's my timer. We're going to try to get to some of the questions. I'm going to remind everybody, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. There's a little box down below on your screen, or on my screen it's down below, but there's a little Q&A box there that we'd like you to put your questions in, because there's so many comments. It's easy to lose track of the questions in the comments. So please, if you put a question in the comments in the chat, please copy it over to the Q&A box. So, I do this every session. Grace Lee Boggs, our mentor and a scholar activist in Detroit, she used to start a lot of conversations with this question. And I'm just going to ask it to you, B. And you may have already actually, I think, answered it. But what time is it on the clock of the world for you, right? What time is it on the clock of the world to you, in terms of like current events, things that are happening? I think you pretty much answered that pretty beautifully, but if you wanted to say a couple words on that while I sort through some of these questions in the Q&A.
The question is, what time is it in the world clock?
On the clock of the world. That's what she used to say.
It's hard to say, because as I talked about Orientalism, right? And that even with something like Gran Torino disrupting the kinds of memories and stereotypes that are so lodged in our cultural imaginary, everything still falls back to those moments of Orientalism and to those moments of anti-Asian racism that are, a part of the past, that we believe have been consigned to the past. But as we're seeing it, it's always a living in between time, and the time, brings us back to the past while we're still in the present. I think about Octavia Butler's book Kindred. Something I read back in high school, and it was a book basically about this woman who was, who lived in the present, but was sort of dragged back into the past, into the antebellum past. And there was this, belief, or the idea of the motif of the book was simply that, African Americans live in this weird situation of being caught in the past, of being haunted by the past, which is also true for, which is also another motif in Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved. And so I think that my understanding of, what time it is simply that, we are still living in a past.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for pointing out Octavia Butler. Students in my next class are actually reading or have actually read Parable of the Sower, an amazing book and so relevant to today. Some questions from the students. They wanted to know what was your parents, your family, your childhood like that brought you to do any of this?
Well, I was a working class Hmong American. Both of my parents were born in Laos and had survived the war and came to the US as refugees. And so, being very working class myself, I had the dream of going into medicine because I thought that medicine was an agent for social change. And also being from a working class background, one wants to go in the direction that provides some kind of stability and security, obviously, because when you're incredibly poor all your life, you want to not be poor anymore. So yeah, I was someone who was very engaged in everything because I wanted to make an impact on this world in some way to make it better, if not for myself, then for my community and for the world at large. So, when Gran Torino came out, as Mai also talked about it being fishy and scammy like, and I think it was what you said, Emily, too. Everyone in the Hmong community at the time was very nervous about what this was because when I first heard about it, it wasn't even Clint Eastwood wasn't even attached to the project yet. And so everyone, this idea of a Hollywood film being made about the Hmong American community was just floating out there with no name attached to it. And then within a couple of months, it was. And then, suddenly the entire Hmong American community was paying attention. And they were paying attention because, it was such a big deal. And so for me, because it was such a big deal, it was, something I wanted to be a part of. And clearly after the film was released, it continued to, matter to me a lot. As much as we can all disagree about the portrayal of the Hmong culture and about the representation of the racial slurs and the use of those slurs, it's still an important film to pay attention to, which is what I was always saying. As much as I don't like Olympus Has Fallen, it was necessary to be able to watch and to glean from these films, popular cultural films, because they are so important in our national discourse. When Olympus Has Fallen came out, there was also a surge of many of us feeling a kind of anti-Asian sentiment at that time too. I think it was Bao Fi who said, oh yeah, after this film came out, a lot of people, started looking at me very differently. And so, as much as we hate it, we have to understand exactly what's going on with pop culture and media, which is why I, dedicated so much of my time to, studying media studies and doing cultural studies for this very reason.
That's excellent segue to one of the questions from one of our students in the Q&A. Safira is asking, how was your background in international politics, media, and cultural studies supported your acting career? And also underneath that, I'm just going to give you the shout out from Michael Rupert, who is from Robbinsdale. Great presentation. When he grew up in Robbinsdale, 60s and 70s, it and the neighboring suburbs were 100% white. Now, tiny Robbinsdale is very diverse, BIPOC and LGBTQ+, Muslims, Christians, Jews, et al. And Brooklyn Park, where I now live, is the most diverse suburb of the Twin Cities. What was it like to be Hmong in Robbinsdale when you lived here? And how did you have that experience inform your performance in Gran Torino? So a little bit about your neighborhood and also your background in international politics, media, and cultural studies.
Well, my education played a big part in giving me the opportunity to see the power of storytelling, as I said. It wasn't until I went to China, did research on the Hmong people there. In China, the Hmong people are called the Miaozu. And it was there that I traveled throughout the rest of Southeast Asia as well, that I came to an understanding of my own identity, of my ethnic identity. And it was because of this that, I saw the potentiality for, telling who I am and for, um, being the kind of face and voice for Hmong Americans. I think that one thing that I came up against a lot was that after Gran Torino came out, I carry that burden of being made into the face and the voice and the mouthpiece of the Hmong American community. That's just the unfortunate fact of having any kind of mainstream visibility, that we all suddenly have to become the voice and face of our communities. Um, I say this all the time, that like Meryl Streep played a Jewish Polish woman in Sophie's Choice. And she may have never had to go on a speaking tour to talk about the Holocaust across Europe and in Poland. But I had to talk about, the secret war. I had to talk about the secret war on the streets here. I had to talk about Southeast Asia. I had to talk about the toxic herbicides and the bombs. And, it just was an unfair thing, obviously. But I realized that there is power, and being able to talk about these things that clearly matter and things that are right. And so it was this process of me studying and learning and grounding myself in thought and scholarship and in intellectual work, that I found the worth of and value of my voice and the value of myself.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing, and great points. We don't think about that, right? As moviegoers, we don't think about that. As scholars, we might think about that, but we don't think about all the issues that come across. But I think it's coming across now because of all the Stop AAPI Hate, Stop Anti-Asian Hate initiatives, and getting actors and celebrities to speak out, which is, I think, positive, but also a challenge.
Right.
All right, I also want to give a shout out to you. I don't know if you realize that your professor, your professor from Brown, Naoko, is here. Hi, and Louisa Shine was here too. I don't know if she's still here, but students had to read the article, the great article interview that she did with you after the film was made. And so shout out and thank you to both those professors for joining us online and in the chat today. Some other questions from the students. Let's see. Aditi asks, in the wake of the anti-Asian violence and injustices, and knowing the history and the context, what can we do to move forward? How can we find hope for the future? And actually, a lot of students ask that on our Canvas website. And thank you, Aditi, for succinctly phrasing it.
I think, as I said just previously, that it's so important to understand and to ground yourself in your voice. And so for me, what I foresee as the path forward is clearly that we have to have some kind of, going back to Antonio Gramsci's saying and the prison notebooks, we must have the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the hope of hope. And so what that means for me is that I believe in storytelling. I believe in us speaking about our truths and living in our truths on our terms. And this means that we need to get more Asian American journalists to tell our stories and to tell them in a way that the media can understand. We need more Asian American history in our curriculum, clearly, because the fact is that we all have to keep referencing the exclusion acts, the internment camps. We have to keep talking about all of these things all the time, as if they're not transparent and obvious enough, as I said. And so Asian American teachers, Asian American professors, Asian American studies, Asian American journalists, writers, actors, and politicians. It's at the beginning of all of this, we had an issue of not having anyone to really talk about this. John Cho, I believe, was like the only person that came out with an op-ed last year. And even then, what else was said really did not reach the same level of attention that, today has generated. with this groundswell support of all these other Asian American celebrities speaking out. So I think that this is what we need to do and what we need to continue naming and calling out so that we can be brought out into the spotlight. To go back to another question as well about what it was like to grow up here in the Twin Cities. There were Hmong American newspapers and outlets here. These smaller ethnic newspapers and journalists and writers telling our stories at the community level. Also local organizations too, like the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, or the Asian American Journalists Association. All of these organizations played a part in terms of how I grew up with my own understanding of the Hmong American community here in the Twin Cities. And so, it didn't feel, I didn't feel a lot of alienation growing up here because there was such a powerful presence of the Hmong American community. So, it just, when a lot of Asian Americans talk about feeling estranged, that's something that's very alien to me. I never felt like I didn't see Asianness because I grew up watching a lot of films from Hong Kong, from Japan, from China, from India, a lot of Bollywood films. And those were the inspirations for me. Of course, there are Asian films made in Asia, but that doesn't defeat the fact that I still grew up watching Asian people and not feeling alienated from my identity. So it mattered a lot to be grounded in my community here and to also be in a very hyper local situation where it wasn't an issue of organizing around who and what we are as Hmong Americans.
Yes. Awesome. Our day project teens loved it when we went to Minnesota, Twin Cities, St. Paul for the Asian Pacific Island American Spoken Word Poetry Summit that Bao Phi helped organize, and it was a whole new world. It was a whole new world for us. We went to the Hmong American Cultural and Arts Center, the Center for CHAT, the Center for Hmong American Arts
and Talent.
Yes. And that was phenomenal. That was just life-changing for a lot of us. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to try to get back to some of these questions, and Mike can probably maybe chime in too. Maita Yang, I'm assuming you're Hmong. How did the staff treat the Hmong actors behind the scenes in Gran Torino?
I could answer that. I think we can contribute too. I think it was a mixture. So if you were one of the main actors, you might have been treated very well. If you were an extra, you were just like another body. Like they might not have any connection to you as like a human being. And so there has been, complex experiences based on who you were.
Well, I can say a little bit more too. I obviously played a big role in the film, so I was always on set and always working with different people. I was basically shooting almost every day. So I will say that like I went in with a belief that I could possibly, add to the character and to the script. Being a Hmong American, an embodied Hmong American person, I thought I could bring some kind of authenticity. And of course, my father is a practicing shaman, and so one of the things that I remember the most is, as I said in the interview as well, which you all read, it was weird watching that scene being done. It's the Hupli ceremony, the soul calling ceremony. And, Mai also talked about it earlier, that the thing about films is that there is the entertainment factor and the aesthetic factor, which means that like, if something has to be shot this way in order to be more aesthetically pleasing, it has to be shot that way because it's a film. And if, anyone who's ever studied the history of cinema knows that this is what cinema has done, like with Nanook of the North and the ways that editing and cutting and slicing and everything of putting the films together, there is space for distortion. And so, the fact is that I also gave my 2 cents to Eastwood, because he did ask me, how does this scene work out? And I said to him, well, shaman stands at the door, everyone else is running around, blah, blah, blah. And, like that didn't really phase him. I don't think it would have looked nice. And so that's why, I always said that, like, the cultural accuracy didn't really matter, because that's not what they were after.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
they made it clear that, that was not something that they were after.
Yeah. There were, if I remember correctly, there were all kinds of blogs and chat discussions about it, about touching a character's head and all these other, a whole bunch of
I
inaccuracies.
just want to add to that, Emily, that question. There is a huge pay gap in the
Yes.
disparity in women and men in general, and then in Asian American women, and compared to the white women. And so I think there's some discrepancy there too, as far as like the actors' pay.
Right.
We don't know the specifics of it, but I will say that there were some disputes about the catering and the food. And one of my friends who her mom owned a restaurant, and she did all of the catering for the food. So if you saw in the movie, the theme was very much rounded around food. Every time you were at Tao's house, people were there eating. And so, they did all the catering, and that
Yeah.
movie, I mean, it was like a $2 million budget.
Right. Right. Was that Caroline Vang's Bangkok 96 restaurant?
Yes.
Shout out to our community partner, Bangkok 96 in Dearborn, Michigan. Our Hmong American owned, amazing community folks supported us totally.
Yes, and I think because the actors didn't have experience, right? So obviously someone who was well known, like an A-lister, might have been paid more, but because these were Hmong actors who were very new, they could get away with paying them whatever they wanted, and many of those actors would have gladly taken it. But I want to reiterate, there is a huge pay gap.
Exactly. Okay, my alarm went off, so we have 5 more minutes left in the class. So B, we're going to do what we call rapid speed questions. Okay, and this is something that I did when I facilitated Q&A with Adrienne Marie Brown, the most amazing facilitator in the world, and a writer and activist and doula. I'm going to ask you the questions from the Q&A box, so you can kind of look at them in advance if you want. And your job is to try to answer in 1 to 5 words. Okay, so we can speed them along. Okay, all right, 1 to 5 words. All right, so I'm just going to go down the list. Armando is asking, what does Orient mean?
An imagined space.
All right. Thank you. Marlena, after many years of intellectual, personal, and social reflection, what are your new terms for accepting acting roles? Also, have you thought of pursuing directing or other production roles? You can say yes or no too. Are you accepting new acting roles? Maybe that's an easier question.
New terms are social justice driven.
Yes. So you are accepting, you're still acting, you're still accepting. Okay. All right. Put that out there. Thank you. Antonio is asking, when Gran Torino being set in Detroit Highland Park, how does this relate to experience? I think we answered that. Do you believe in the theory? Oh, Lisa, don't. Okay. We have, I'll come back to that. All right. Cody is asking, how do you address the racist beliefs that are faced by Asian people, which are rooted in Satanism, mentalism? The prejudice against those. An assumption that may be perceived as a positive, but still robs people of their individuality and is used by white supremacists to label Asian people as a threat. This is not a 1 to 5 word answer.
It really is not.
Okay.
The model minority myth is still racist.
Yes.
As Frank Chen said, racist love is still racist.
That's right. All right. Okay. The earlier question was, are there any resources that you can recommend on Hmong American history, Hmong American community? That was one of them.
Read Kaugalia, Ma Vang. They have several books out.
Yes, my favorites. Cody, have you addressed the race? Oh, we already did that. Thanks. Anonymous, do you both, Mai and B, believe that Asian Americans can change the false narrative that has been forced upon them? How can others who may not identify with Asian American community also change this narrative?
Yes, I think that's what we are doing, talking about our experiences and organizing. We organized when Chongberry Zong was shot 27 times in the back, right? We organized during that time, and now we're organizing all the rallies that are happening across our country, and the legislative changes that are happening in our country, and the funding going towards civil rights and creating hate crime units, making sure that people are reporting. So we are changing the narrative.
Excellent.
So my answer would be writing, speaking up, being politicized, and organizing.
Excellent. Okay. I am colorful. How does your family feel about you being an actor now, activist, speaking out for the Hmong community?
I have brought honor to us all.
Absolutely. And that is so great. I'm so glad you're doing 1 to 5 words. Kerwin, do you think Eastwood's character was the classic white savior? Do you think the film helped or hurt or didn't affect the Hmong community? I think we already.
Yes, Mulan.
Okay, and this is a Japanese American filmmaker in San Francisco, former journalist. Shout out to Kerwin. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, Professor Roland Wong, who was one of the attorneys in the Vincent Chin case, asks, we are just learning about the struggles of the 8 Asian women who were killed in Atlanta, a story that should be revealed and told. Given what you know about producers, if you know, do you think there might be interest in doing a film project on their profiles and struggles? I mean, it's a yes or no, I guess.
Always humanize the victims.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. And then Anonymous, what is your approach to acting going forward? How will you balance your responsibilities as an activist and as an artist?
Being politically minded and being an artist.
You did it! Wow, amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you so much, B. Vang, Mai Shong, much love, Sarah Day Dion, Lisa Toon, everybody in our American Culture 353 class. Thank you, thank you, thank you all. We'll see you next week for James Benny Wilson, filmmaker. Same time, a different place, but we'll have it on our website. Thank you, everybody. Much love. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Stop AAPI hate.
Yes.
Thank you.